On a sunny Friday afternoon. So my name's Nayiri and I'm joined with my colleague Dustin, and today we're going to be looking at decolonizing generative AI, and specifically a project that we've been working on, creating some educational resources on this topic. And we'll talk a bit more about the aims of that and what we were hoping to achieve from these resources in a moment. So I'll just pass over to Dustin now to give you a bit of an introduction as to how this all came about.
Thanks, Nayiri. So just a bit about myself before I start. I've worked as an EFL instructor before moving into English for academic purposes, and then learning development. And throughout that time, also have been involved in digital education. And since 2017, been mostly involved in digital education. So the reason why I think I was interested in this was the discussions around generative AI, which took off last year, I think, or no, actually, was it 2 years ago, at the end of 2022, and then really started coming to a head in kind of the beginning of 2023. So what I did was to try and understand what things like ChatGPT, DALL-E, and all those other generative AI tools were doing. I experimented a bit, wrote a blog about it, which I can share. And then from that, that was about over 2 months when I was doing that last year, almost a year ago. Nayiri contacted me to make a workshop out of basically what the blog was all about. And as a result, we co-created these materials together. And because we were both interested in it, we both understand that there are implications for using generative AI. Generative AI, the algorithms, so on and so forth, they are underpinned by things that we should be aware of and that students should be aware of. Because just like any tool, there's not necessarily an awareness around how these tools are created and what algorithms and what underpinnings inform them. So yeah, that's how this kind of came into being. I'll just put a link to the other two things. There's the workshop itself, and the first one is the kind of blog. Okay, next slide.
Brill, thank you, Dustin. So as Dustin mentioned, just to give a brief introduction to myself as well. So I'm a senior lecturer in learning development, so always looking for ways in which I can support students in developing various academic skills, one of which is critical and analytical thinking. So when I came across Dustin's blog, I thought, wow, this could make a really interesting workshop, also bringing in the AI elements as well. So as was said, I contacted him to ask for his permission to create a workshop based on the blog that he wrote. And then we set about creating these educational materials. And we've also created some feedback surveys as well, which we'll talk to you more about in a moment. But we're really happy to say, actually, that recently we posted the resources to various websites, but Learn Higher, which some of you might have come across, I believe Justin's put the link in the chat as well. Learn Higher is a really great website full of other resources as well that are super useful. And we were successful recently in winning the most valued resource. Dustin's got his trophy there. He's more prepared than I am, but you can see the images there with us, both of us with our trophies. So we got this news a couple of weeks ago, so we thought we'd include it in this presentation. So essentially our resource is the most downloaded of the year, of all of the other brilliant Learn Higher resources. So at the time that I last checked, we're on about 131 downloads. So that might have increased. Hopefully it will increase even more after this presentation as well. But that just gives you a bit of background and a bit of context as to how this came about. Dustin was actually at the award ceremony himself. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Dustin. I couldn't make it, but the trophy, the very heavy package, was sent to me in the post.
No, it was a surprise. Obviously, when I set about exploring and then writing the blog to understand the implications, that wasn't a goal that we had in mind, I don't think, was to kind of win awards. But it was good because it's good validation for this work, and maybe that's a good kind of encouragement rather for others who might want to experiment, because sometimes it does pay off, especially when you're doing it, from the heart, so to speak. I've since I'm trying to make it into a publishable paper, failing miserably because there's intersectionality, and intersectionality isn't understood by a lot of people, because this is looking at technology, imagery, racism, gendered issues, so on and so forth, and there's a link to that. But yeah, that's us. We didn't know each other before. We just, one wrote something, the other read it, and then someone reached out.
Yeah, and I think it goes to show how great achievements, but also very random, can come out of things that you perhaps didn't intend to happen at the start. But that leads on nicely to us talking a bit about what the objectives are. So Dustin, if you wanted to talk about the purpose in the investigation. So these are basically the main objectives that we wanted to reach through the creation of the resources.
So what we're hoping is to kind of put across is, the workshop, it's to get users, I'll just say users, meaning staff, students, whoever, to critically explore how generative AI tools have a problematic nature because of their underpinnings, because of the kind of programming in the background that goes on, which then we use as users to, through inputting queries, which then outputs things that are problematic. And I don't mean factually incorrect necessarily things, I mean imagery. So a lot of people have talked about ChatGPT and text generators, but there is scope for educators and business people, whoever else, scientists, academics generally, to create images with these tools. So it's all about equipping learners with the kind of critical exploration and abilities through practice to kind of make ethical decisions while investigating those underpinnings of generative AI and dissecting biases, because they do still create imagery that is xenophobic, racist, racially gendered, so on and so forth.
Yeah, and we also wanted to, help develop or develop critical and analytical thinking within those that were participating in the workshop. So we very much wanted this to be a workshop that could be tailored to various groups of students, whether that's by level or by discipline. And it is something that we welcome colleagues to tailor depending on what's going to be most relevant to their group of students. But that is a key objective for us, to develop these really crucial skills that we want to see improved within our students as they progress throughout their degree, no matter what discipline it might be in. But also through this medium of a workshop, it was really about creating that communication and that dialogue. So allowing a space for that to happen, to actually talk about these topics. So, a lot's been said recently about the ethical complexities of AI. So this was a really good opportunity to provide that space for students to discuss this, and particularly its impact on marginalized communities. So those are our key objectives and things that we wanted participants to gain out of the workshop. And we did want it to be a really interactive session. So in order for us to be able to meet our objectives, it did have to be as interactive as possible. So in the workshop, we have embedded a variety of activities, first of all, to help students or participants understand the biases in generative AI more generally. And then it's about developing these critical thinking skills that are really essential for recognizing and then potentially addressing these biases. And as Dustin mentioned, there is a lot of different topics discussed, but they all kind of intersect and they relate to each other. So, you know, race, ethnicity, decolonial thinking. So these are all concepts that we introduce to students. Most, if not all of these terms they'll have heard of before, but we do spend some time talking about what these terms actually mean in terms of definitions, and how they relate to this topic in particular. So they're all, you know, big themes, big topics within themselves, but within this workshop they do intersect, and there's a lot of overlap in the discussions as well. So again, for us to reach our objectives, it was really important that we made the session as interactive as possible. And then, well, did you want to talk about this, Dustin? This came from you in terms of the blog that you initially wrote and the prompts that you decided to use with the image generator.
Sure. Before I talk about this, I was just going to mention two things. This is underpinned by research as well. Maybe not as rigorous as it could be, but one of the references that I looked up and kind of read up on was this one. It's called Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. So she has done quite a bit of research in this area, and she's not the only one. There's a few others, but this is one good reference that if you're interested in this area, you can understand deeper how these images, for example, are created based upon the algorithms that humans create that then go and generate these kind of images. And before I move on just to the images in this discussion, I was going to say one thing that I don't know if you thought about it, Nayiri, but I was just thinking, like, we work in higher education, but if you work in a college or know people who work in colleges or even schools, this workshop could easily be done probably at those levels as well. Might be some difficult topics, but wide applicability. So yeah. As far as how I came to this topic, I'll be very honest, I was just being silly. I thought about, like, okay, let's see what we could create. And so I thought, okay, sweet old grannies making pancakes. Why? Because I had lived and worked in Russia for a while and in Eastern Europe generally, and other kind of Central Asian countries and Asian countries as well. Interesting. The symbol of the grandmother is particularly great. It's a central part of culture. So I thought, okay, let's see what they produce. And pancakes are, well, not international entirely. They're pretty popular in many different forms, so to speak, throughout Europe, North America. Yeah. So what I thought was just let's add some queries. Let's make some queries around what it's going to produce, right? Just to see what it would actually produce. And it's through this dialogue and discussion that having learners look at these images to see what they can pull out of the images, even if they don't have any background knowledge of those images or of those contexts and cultures. Because there's quite a lot you can get out of an image by just looking at it, analyzing it, looking at the atmosphere, looking at the representations of people or these avatars, which are supposed to be people, and how they're dressed, hairstyles, whether they show their hair or not, so on and so forth. So through this, it was to kind of engage students, learners, people undertaking this workshop through a dialogue and discussion to get them to really think about these images. So almost, and this is me reflecting in the moment, almost having them slow down, because if you think about people today who have mobile phones, usually we're just sitting on our phones scrolling, and quickly looking at an image, contemplating it for a moment and then going on to the next one. Okay, especially if you look through Instagram quite a lot or any of those image-based apps. Oh, okay. Nayiri.
Yeah, so you can see at the bottom the images that were generated. We do have some larger images on the slides coming up. And then we have a worksheet that we'll send in the chat later, which relates to an activity. But, as Dustin said, the various prompts were put into DALL-E, and the same prompt was used, but just changing the country or the race that the granny was. So it was sweet old grannies making pancakes, and then that was replaced with Polish, Russian, American, and then US racialized as Black. So we're going to go through the images now. I'll just pause for a brief moment on each one, just so you can see the images that were created. So first one, this is the representation of the Russian grandmothers. And Dustin, feel free to add some bits that you've also put in the blog as well, as to why these representations could be problematic. But this is the Russian grandmothers. So that's what was created. Then you've got the Polish grandmothers. Then this is the American grandmothers. And then finally, you've got the grandmothers from the US racialized as Black. So 4 different groups of images, 4 different images of each, with some differences in them. So as I was reading Dustin's blog and some of the points that were raised in there, I could see or I could start to see how this could be turned into a workshop to enable the students to look at these images, be able to analyze the various aspects of them, and in turn pick up some of the areas that are problematic, and how generative AI is, or potentially is, perpetuating certain stereotypes of these different groups in society. So how we go back, you're on mute, Dustin, if you want to say.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I was going to say, if you can go back.
Of course.
The reason by the way, for context, again, these images were created July, August last year.
Yeah.
Okay. If you asked it the same question, they're going to look different. They will not necessarily look the same. And I see that there's a question. Intrigued is your session title, which centers decolonizing, but there's been no mention of this so far. Can you explain what you mean by decolonizing AI? So, okay. For context, I started studying a doctorate in education in 2020 and started looking into decoloniality in 2021. So since about 2021, I've been going deeper and deeper into decolonizing and decoloniality. I also co-led our community practice on decolonizing. How is it related to decolonizing AI? Well, the first thing, part of decoloniality, is you need to interrogate systems and structures, or tools if you want as well, to understand what they're informed by, to then understand why they produce what they do produce. Okay, why they would create such representations. From this perspective, I'll just comment, because you asked me, Nayiri, to comment. These images are xenophobic. They're also gendered, because this is portraying a fairy tale representation of Russian culture. Even the Polish ones are very similar. It's like a fairy-taled version that a Anglo-American or Anglo-European imaginary might think of when they think of Russia, so, or Poland even. So if you think about that, that is incredibly problematic. The other reasonings or the other things to kind of consider, if we look at all of these avatar representation of women, they are all, can you go back to the Russian ones real quick? They're all white. Russia is a multicultural country. I think I don't have the stats in front of me, but I think it's about 25%. They have 180 or something nationalities, and they certainly are not all Russian, right? And yes, what first third ministry is saying, yeah, there's so many ethnicities in Russia, lots of Russians look, well, yeah, they have this more Mongoloid or Asian appearance because of the mixture that went on over the years. Some do look very European, so like vampires, very pasty with blue eyes. But this image portrays a certain thing that isn't entirely true. Now, the other two, can you go to the American ones?
Sure.
Because it reflects what that person just said, where indigenous were here first, and for example, grandmothers in America should be, yeah. I mean, the problem with the question, of course, the query was not perfect, show me, I think it was create images of sweet old American grandmothers creating pancakes. Well, they're all white. Okay, that's a problem in itself. Problem two, America is very diverse. There's also a third problem that, yes, if you say America, what do you mean? Do you mean Turtle Island? Do you mean all of the Americas? If you're a Spanish speaker, when you say America, usually it's like all the Americas. Whereas Americans, they'll refer to the US as America, effectively obscuring and erasing like the rest of the Americas. The US is a diverse place. About 25% of the population is non-white. So if we were to go just by pure stats, one of those should be non-white. Okay, but they're not. The other thing to consider, this is where I fail as a man. I know nothing about women's hairstyles and what they represent, but friends were looking at this who were female, who were women, and they were like, those hairstyles represent a certain class, a certain amount of wealth that they may have that they put into their appearance. Because, yeah, and even how they're dressed, but also the atmosphere as well, which we can touch on later. But this is why the next image, this is why I had to actually ask it, create representations of sweet old Black American women, because in that first image, it wouldn't. And then these images are even worse because they almost all, I think the top one, the right one, and the bottom right all represent the stereotypical version of what's called a mammy. Okay, I don't know if anyone is from North America. If you are, then you might know Aunt Jemima's syrup, maple syrup. It's kind of like a slave motherly figure, right? Larger, big features, bright colors as well. But even how they're all dressed, except for maybe the one in the lower left, sorry, they're all dressed as if they are cleaners. So they're in roles of servitude, which again is another problematic issue and is another layer to this. So there are so many layers that you could peel back from these images, right? And your lived experience will inform part of that, but so will dialogue, discussion, and reading. And that's why this is all incredibly important for understanding how, well, maybe not necessarily how, but why to decolonize AI, or why AI needs to be decolonized. The how is going to involve the technical side of things, right? Actually going into the code, which is created by humans. And if you think about it, it's created by a particular set of humans who are in places like Silicon Valley, where lots of giant corporations are, in other areas. Ireland, I think, is another big tech area. I don't know where the one is in the UK, and then of course in various parts of Europe, so on and so forth. Okay, sorry to interrupt, Nayiri.
No, thank you so much for adding adding to that, and we will touch on that again when we look at the worksheet that we've created to accompany the workshop, because we pick up on some of those key themes that Dustin just mentioned. Of course, there's, you know, different frameworks that you can use, different ways that you can analyze something, particularly an image, but I actually came across this from a different resource on the Learn Higher website that was created by another colleague, also looking at images and how you can, the name of the resource is Using Visual Sources for Developing Analytical Thinking. So again, if you want to have a look at that, it's on the Learn Higher website. And I've taken that slide, this slide, sorry, on the screen from that workshop, because I thought it really nicely broke down how you can go about doing that analysis, particularly for something that is visual. So first of all, what is the description? So what is it that the image is showing you? When might it have been taken? Who is the image and where? So this helps you to perhaps, well, first of all, describe or summarize a certain theory or viewpoint or situation that's depicted in an image. And then it also helps to provide context to a subject. Then the next stage is looking at it in a bit more detail. So going into that analysis and evaluation. So why are certain things portrayed in this way? How is that done? And so what? So this helps, or starts to help participants understand the complexity and the depth behind some of these topics and some of the things that the image is portraying. But it also potentially provides reasons and comes to some sort of informed conclusion as to why things are the way they are. So by making these comments and doing that analysis and evaluation, students or participants of the workshop can start making links and also thinking about the implications of the images being like this. And of course, that final step is really important as well. I mean, the participants might not be able to do this straight away, but we also wanted to highlight the fact that these conclusions that they're coming to through the analysis and through the evaluation, it of course needs to be supported with academic evidence. So I thought that was a really useful breakdown, and one we've incorporated into our workshop as well, to help with visual images specifically. So how do we support participants in having their discussions? Well, taking some of the language from this framework, we created this worksheet. So the blank version and the version with suggested answers can be found on the Learn Higher website. So it's part of the download. And obviously in the workshop, you give the blank version to participants, and this facilitates their discussion. You can see at the top that the discussion is separated into different things that really do stand out within the images. So it gives them a bit more of a focus, looking at things like the atmosphere, the decor, and the clothing of the avatars. And it also looks at expressions and ethnicity as well. So there's a line there for each of the 4 groups of images. And we go through that 3-stage process of, first of all, describing what the image is showing with regards to those themes. Then thinking about, okay, what does this actually mean? So starting to analyze it. And then the evaluation. So what do you know? What academic evidence is there to support some of the points you're making as part of the analysis? So some of the things Dustin mentioned already, like hairstyle, for example, and how the hairstyles represented in the images of American grandmothers, it perhaps alludes to being from a certain social class. They were all very similar. It looked like they'd been set in rollers. So that's just one of the things that does come up. I'm not sure, Dustin, if you wanted to add anything else that you've written in the blog in terms of these themes and what could be deemed as problematic through the images.
I mean, I was just thinking, I was just reflecting, like, we probably didn't realize it, but the workshop could be a reflexive activity in itself, even for the educator, because there's so much that some people would pick up on that others wouldn't pick up on. Okay. If a BME member of staff was to deliver this workshop, I'm sure they would pick up on certain things that I've not recognized. But doing this kind of activity analysis, it's meant to kind of deepen not only awareness, but also picking up on really uncovering, what is it doing? Okay. Although we haven't quite touched on why it's doing that. Okay. But yeah, let me just go back to the actual blog.
Yeah, sure. While you're going to the blog, I'll just talk about my experience of actually delivering this workshop. So I've only had the opportunity to deliver it once, but it was really interesting to obviously see it in practice. So it's one thing, as we all know, it's one thing designing something and another thing delivering. So what I would say, if any of you are thinking about delivering this or a version of this workshop in the future, make sure you allow enough time for this discussion. So I think I definitely didn't do that. So that's part of my own reflection as a practitioner. But really now allowing enough time for this discussion, because one, there's quite a few different images to look at. Two, there's so many things that can be discussed. And as a facilitator, it was, part of my role to support participants in finding those things and allowing them to move from that description into the analysis. So that's a really important point to remember as well, is, most of the participants were confident in describing what the image was showing. As we know with a lot of our students, when it comes to their writing as well, description is the most of the time the easiest part, but it's moving into that analysis and evaluation that's going to allow them to move into those higher order thinking skills, and also allow them to improve their writing and to get the higher grades. So that's really important as well. But yeah, definitely allowing enough time for this discussion. And like I said, we do have a completed worksheet based off of some of the things that are discussed in the blog. But as was just mentioned, there are things that you might notice that we haven't picked up on. And of course, you can bring these things to the discussion. But we have a kind of a completed version of this worksheet that you can give to participants at the end of the workshop, or email it to them after, so they have something that allows them to think about this post-workshop as well.
Yeah. And as far as, the key questions, I'll just put these in the chat. Those were the key questions that this kind of workshop is trying to get people to understand more deeply. Why are these images, these avatars represented in the way that they are? Okay. If anything, what do they get right? What do they get wrong? How are they problematic? Which, yeah, that's the next slide. So it's really trying to exercise and develop further the kind of critical thinking abilities of students and of staff as well, because sometimes these things are taken for granted. And by no means is the workshop or the blog perfect, right? Because there's a lot of things there's a lot of different angles that they both could take, depending on, again, who's delivering it, what you're analyzing as well. Because you could easily change the images to something else. And actually, I just had a quick look, because here is a journal article that actually talks about biases that generative AI can do for nuclear medicine, of all things, right? I I was just having a quick look because students or staff, academics, lecturers, teachers, whatever, might go and get these things to create, say, parts of the human anatomy, okay, which will bring its own risks, especially for training future doctors and nurses, because, again, those would be informed by different data sets out there, which may not be entirely full or correct. And they may actually indeed be full of kind of biases that would skew what people, professionals in XYZ profession, whatever, should actually really know. Of course, touching on, issues of racism and gender and that kind of thing as well, and xenophobia. And I think what you were going to say, Nayiri, or this kind of slide, the workshop, ideally, learners, teachers, whatever, might read the blog first, or at least do some pre-reading. They don't have to read my blog. They could read something around this topic to then understand, okay, why are these things problematic? To then be able to understand what can be done to effectively understand, well, the underpinnings and what we can do to stop such things from being created in the first place. Misrepresentations, effectively. Why are these misrepresentations being kind of created?
Yeah. And on the other side as well, I mean, you can see in the questions, the third question is, what, if anything, do the representations get right? And a really interesting point that came through in the discussions when I delivered this to my students as part of a social science foundation program, was a student commenting, well, yes, I agree that these images are showing stereotypes, but don't we need stereotypes? And I thought, wow, okay, so that's a very interesting point, because some people argue that stereotypes, they're a form of representation. They might not always be a positive representation necessarily, but it is a form of representation. And, if you are from that particular country or of that race, and you might have looked at some of these images and thought, oh yeah, like I recognize that. I feel represented somehow. So I think that's an important point to raise as well. And I think it was really interesting that came from a student, and it opened up another form of discussion that we necessarily hadn't thought of, in terms of, stereotypes and the positive things that they can bring, as well as some of the, the problematic messages that are coming through in these AI generated images. But we'll move to the next part of the session because time is moving on swiftly. But just to say as well that, as part of this, what we wanted to do is, if we could, measure some of those objectives that we outlined at the start. So we have created a feedback survey. I'll just leave this slide here so you can glance at these. It's just about some of the conclusions that we come to, or we try to come to by the end of the workshop. Essentially want to get the students thinking. So, we're not necessarily going to solve this issue by the end of the workshop, but we just want them to think about what are the outputs of AI and how they can be problematic, and what we need to do to help minimize some of those problematic outputs. But we have created a feedback survey. So if you go to the resources, you'll see the link to this. And we're really keen to get feedback from both participants of the workshops, i.e. students that you deliver to, or potentially deliver to, but also educational practitioners. So whether you're a lecturer in a particular discipline, whether you work in academic skills and development, and you're delivering this workshop as part of a program that your university runs, for all students. Like we said, there's various different ways that you can run this workshop, and we're more than happy for people to take the base of the idea and to adapt it according to their needs. But we'd be really keen to hear from you. You can see an example of some of the questions that we ask in the feedback survey. We've not had many responses so far, so we'd love to have more. But in terms of some of the responses that we have had, so the qualitative responses, these are from some of the student participants that I delivered to. So how it's helped them become more aware of the representation of stereotypes within different ethnicities and cultural groups. And then this was from a colleague who adapted the workshop and delivered it to their own group of creative arts students. So how it was something that was needed and highly rigorous yet accessible. So if you are thinking about delivering this workshop, however you want to do it, whether you're adapting it, keeping it the same, adding your own things in there as well, we'll be really grateful if you could complete that feedback survey, because that will then help us to think about the workshop moving forward, potentially creating a version 2 and then a version 3 of it. And essentially our success metrics, and we're attempting to measure these through the feedback survey, especially the one that goes to the participants, is the development of those critical thinking skills among participants and just creating that awareness and sensitivity towards ethical considerations in both AI development, but also its deployment as well. So I'm going to pass back to Dustin now, who's going to speak about some subsequent experimentation that he's done. And then we've got a little bit of time to discuss this, and then we'll open up for a short Q&A.
Okay, I'll just be very quick with this in the interest of time. So yeah, I redid the prompts. I reran the prompts earlier this year in ChatGPT as part of DALL-E. And if you want to just show them, Nayiri, they look more realistic, the images, but they're still problematic. There's the kind of Russian woman, again, very still fairy tale, extremely fairy tale looking, which is very odd, you know, very strange, especially having lived over there. If you want to just go to the next couple of ones, Polish ones, it looks slightly more modern, but again, more aesthetically pleasing. They look more human, so to speak. But still, you can imagine or guess what some of the issues might be. And if you want to just show the next two. Yeah, still very problematic. I would love to have a lot of plants, but yeah. So what are your thoughts? We'd like to open it up to you. That way there's at least some time to kind of discuss or ask questions.